Whenever someone talks about Final Fantasy as a series, one of the main talking points and features that is mentioned is the use of summons. Over the years, these creatures have become an integral part of the beloved franchise. Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be looking specifically at summons within the mainline Final Fantasy series and how the use of them has evolved over time. A summon is a creature which can be called upon by the party to aid them in battles, and can have offensive, supportive or curative effects. They were first introduced in Final Fantasy III and have since become a staple of the series, although they were not featured in the first two games. Later installments of the series, namely Final Fantasy Dissidia, explain that during the events of these two games the creatures had been sealed in an interdimensional rift which, although not specifically mentioned in the original versions of those games, it does add to the world building of the series and the lore in giving justification for their absence in these two titles. The first installment that actively included summons was Final Fantasy III. Summons could be used by party members that had one of three job titles: Evokers, Sages and Summoners. Each summon had three possible abilities. Depending on which version of the game you played depends on exactly how the summon ability works. When playing the 3D version of the game, Evokers and Sages could randomly cast one of the first two abilities, which would either be a support ability or a direct attack. If however the Summoner job class uses a summon, it exclusively uses a third ability which always directly attacks the enemy. If however you are playing the 2D version of the game, Sages can also draw out the more powerful third summoning ability. Final Fantasy IV changes things up a bit. Rather than specific job titles being able to use the summon ability, this now resides exclusively with the character Rydia. Rydia can summon various monsters which in this game are referred to as Eidolons, originally simply referred to as Phantom Beasts, which similarly to the previous entry will either provide status boosts, healing effects or directly attack the enemy. Final Fantasy IV saw the summons from the previous title return along with other new creatures, and many of these would become a staple of the series and return in future releases. Moving on to the next installment in the series, Final Fantasy V saw the return of the job system, of which summons are initially exclusive to the summoner. Job, a slightly simplified version of what we saw in Final Fantasy III. Instead, now the summons themselves are separated into 5 categories or levels. While the summoner job class can summon any creature by default, if the player wishes to use a summon with a character who has a different job title, they would first need to level the summoner job title up to the required level. For example, the Chocobo summon only requires the summoner's level to be 1, however more powerful summons would require the summoner to be a higher level. Bahamut, for example, would require the summoner to be level 5 in order for other party members to be able to summon it. Final Fantasy VI saw away with the mechanics previously used for summoning and instead required the player to obtain Magicite. This is a magic stone that is attributed to a summon which in this game are referred to as Espers. When equipped by a party member, this Magicite teaches them magic, grants stat boosts and allows them to summon the Esper that the Magicite is associated with. Each Esper has a unique ability when summoned in battle and will either grant the party stat boosts, heal the party from any negative status effects currently afflicting them, or attack the enemy directly. These can be obtained either by finding them, by simply progressing through the story, or by defeating certain bosses and completing certain dungeons. Moving on now to Final Fantasy VII, the mechanics around both summoning and magic in general were switched up completely for this entry with the introduction of Materia. Materia allowed players more freedom in terms of how they wanted their party to function and the specific roles for each party member. There are various different types of Materia which allowed players to teach their party members different abilities ranging from support abilities, command abilities, individual magic spells, and of course the ability to use summons. Rather than having specific party members that can summon each creature, you would need to have the relevant summons Materia equipped by the character you wish to summon them with, and as you can only obtain one of each summons. Materia, this means you can only have each summon equipped to one party member at a time. Whilst the combat system was completely overhauled for the remake trilogy, this mechanic is largely the same as the original release, with the exception of how the Materia is generally obtained to begin with, and rather than each summon immediately performing AoE abilities, they are instead summoned to assist in combat as if they were another party member before being able to perform their ultimate attacks. Final Fantasy VIII is a bit of a controversial entry in the series for multiple reasons. The main reason for this being the combat system. This entry introduced the junction system. The junction system was only used in this particular entry in the Final Fantasy series, and when it came to summons at least worked in a similar way to how Materia worked in the previous entry. That being that a summon, or GF as they are referred to in this installment, can only be equipped by one party member at a time. That however is where the similarities end. You obtain magic using the draw ability with each character, and then you can junction this magic to boost individual stats. Whilst this doesn't at face value seem too difficult to understand, it did mean that with careful planning you could max out your party's stats very early on in the game, almost taking the challenge. you would expect from a Final Fantasy game out of the game completely. That being said, for those who couldn't grasp the junction system and how it worked, it ultimately made the later stages of the game much harder, as you would struggle to get anywhere near the max value for any of your stats through levelling alone. The summons in this game are mainly equipped by characters in order to use the junction system effectively, and whilst in my opinion the summons in this game have some of the best animations in the series, even to date they are made largely redundant in terms of use in battle, due to the amount you can buff your main party using this battle system and how easy it becomes to abuse overdrives. The next instalment in the series, Final Fantasy IX, goes back to a similar system as earlier releases, in that summons can be called upon by one of two specific party members, Dagger and Eiko. In this instalment, the summons abilities can either be supportive or offensive, and the effectiveness or power is based on math. The very first time the summon is used, you will get the full animation for said summon and 100% of its effectiveness. Every time you use that same summon after that, there will either be a 33% or 10% chance of getting the full animation again, generally based on the difference between your current MP and the overall MP cost of the summon times 2. You can guarantee the full summon animation by having the boost ability equipped. The effectiveness of Dagger's summons is relatively straightforward, being based on the length of the animation played when the player casts summon an item stock. The longer the animation, the more powerful the effect will ultimately be. Whilst in her trance, Dagger's summon command changes to Eidolon, which increases the chance of the summon having a stronger effect, or the full animation, and the summon you choose will also have a chance of reappearing as long as Dagger remains in her trance and isn't removed from play, although the random summons do not expend the player's MP, they are generally weaker than when they were originally summoned. Final Fantasy X was the first game in the series to give players more control over what the summons actually do whilst in play, essentially becoming another party member for the duration of the summons effects. Yuna is the only member of the main party who can cast summons, so they are only available to the player while she is in the field of play, with the exception of 3 optional Aeons. The player acquires these as they progress through the game by completing puzzles at each of the temples in the game's world known as the Cloister of Trials. Once you complete each trial, you will be granted the ability to summon the respective Aeon to assist in battle. These summon stats will naturally increase the more Yuna's stats increase as you progress through the sphere grid and by participating in more battles, or can be increased using spheres themselves. In terms of the lore, these summons are required as part of the Summoner's Pilgrimage in order to perform the final summoning and defeat Sin. However, as becomes evident as the story progresses, defeating Sin in this manner only results in the cycle of Sin's destruction repeating itself. As such, the player's objective switches to finding a way of breaking the cycle whilst assisting Yuna on her pilgrimage. With the optional Aeons, there is one which operates in a slightly different way to the others, Yojimbo. While it does appear as if another member of the party, rather than having full control over the summon, it will perform one of 4 attacks based on the amount of gil the player gives to it. These vary from attacks that affect a single opponent to an attack that will instantly defeat all enemies on the field. This includes bosses and super bosses. Final Fantasy XI is the first game in the series to delve into the world of MMORPGs and returns to the job titles when it comes to the general combat mechanics. In order to unlock the Summoner's job title, you would first need to reach level 30 with a starting job title and complete the I Can Hear a Rainbow quest before they can unlock the Summoner job title. Once unlocked, it allows the player to summon multiple avatars, as they are referred to in this title, who will aid them in battle once you complete their complementary quest lines. Most of these avatars will be familiar to fans of the series, as they are largely returning summons from previous titles. The next entry in the series, Final Fantasy XII, went back to a more traditional method of obtaining the summons, whereby the player simply has to defeat them for them to become available to summon in battle. The Espers, as they are referred to in this game, however, differ from those in the rest of the mainline series, in that they only appear as summons in this game. Most of them are actually based off of the Lucavi in Final Fantasy Tactics, or past bosses in previous Final Fantasy games. In terms of how the summons work in the original version of the game, whilst they are in play, the Espers largely function as if they are separate entities and cannot be controlled by the player, whereas in the Zodiac version of the game, whilst the Esper's gambits cannot be altered, they can be toggled off and on, and the player can directly control their abilities. Espers can only be assigned to one of your party members, and they share their level with the character that is summoning them. As well as this, each Esper unlocks certain licenses on the license board, which means if you assigned an Esper to certain characters in the original version of the game, it had the potential to make certain licenses unobtainable. Summons in Final Fantasy XIII are Eidolons, which also appear in one form or another in the sequels. Final Fantasy XIII-2 and Lightning Returns. In Final Fantasy XIII, the Eidolons are sent to the part members when they falter on their path, and as such they are all obtained as part of the story. Each character obtains their own unique summon as part of the story. When they first appear, you will need to defeat them in order to progress, although the goal is not to deplete their health, but to fill the Gestalt gauge. The battles themselves are not immensely difficult on their own, however at the start of each battle the Eidolon will cast Doom on the player, which gives you a limited amount of time to complete the battle before the Doom timer hits 0, which results in an immediate game over. In terms of gameplay, once you have obtained the summons, they can be used in battle by spending 3 TP. The summon will then replace the rest of your party and fight alongside you. Once summoned, you can then also activate Jest Alt mode, which has the summon change into a form that the summoner can ride. This form allows the player to directly control the actions of the summon and prevents the summoner from taking any damage. Separately, once the summon is dismissed, it will fully heal all members of the party, which makes it incredibly useful as a last resort in difficult battles. Final Fantasy XIV was the second MMORPG in the series and was the natural successor to Final Fantasy XI. While not immediately available, you can unlock the Summoner job title by first reaching level 30 with the Arcanist class and completing all the associated quest lines. Once unlocked, you can then begin to level up the Summoner class. The higher your level, the more advanced summons you can use to assist you in battle, all of which require you to have Carbuncle already summoned prior to casting. Separately to this, many familiar summons from the series can be faced as bosses in the form of primals. Although you do not gain the summon from defeating these primals, it does potentially yield powerful weapons, armour, mounts and story progression when following certain quest lines. Final Fantasy XV was the first game in the series to fully embrace the open world feel that many people come to expect with modern RPGs. It introduced a completely new combat system which complemented the open world feel and allowed more freedom of movement during combat, ultimately making the player feel more in control of all aspects of the battle itself. When it comes to the summons, these are acquired by obtaining the mark of the Astral that you wish to summon and are all obtained as part of the story. There is noticeably fewer summons in this game, and very specific conditions must be met to be able to summon them in the first place. For instance, Leviathan is much more likely to be available as a summon when there is a body of water nearby. That, along with other factors, contribute to the likelihood players will be given the prompt to activate the summon. There is also a considerable grace period, once a summon has been used, during which no other summon can be used, which means using them more sparingly than you may be used to in previous titles to ensure they are not wasted. Whilst there is certainly fewer summons to obtain, the manner in which they are obtained and then used is certainly the most cinematic in the series, up until the point this entry was released and gave them the all-powerful feeling that you would expect of these borderline deities. In a similar fashion to the previous entry, Final Fantasy XVI went a completely different direction when it came to what we know and love as summons. All the featured icons, as they're called in this installment, have featured in previous games in the series, however, where in most previous titles you have controlled the entire party, allowing you to ultimately control any of the summons you want. Final Fantasy XVI builds on the combat mechanics from Final Fantasy XV in that you can only control one character, in this instance Clive. Each of the icons share an almost symbiotic relationship with their dominants, and as such each icon can only be summoned by their respective dominant. Whilst Clive can gain certain abilities from other icons, the only one you can physically summon or control in the main game is Ifrit. And unlike previous entries, the scenarios in which you can take control of Ifrit are scripted, so you cannot summon the creature at will. Like in most previous titles, with the exception of 15 of course, this does however add to the world building of this game somewhat. Although you cannot control your icon at will in the story, each dominant calls upon their respective icon at a cost. It wears away at their very being. So, whilst you cannot control the icons at will, it does reinforce the idea that the continued use of the summons will eventually completely wear away the dominant. Whilst in control of Ifrit, and even in the scenes where you are watching other icons, you can tell the developers wanted to go with more of a cinematic experience than that of most previous entries in the series, and whilst few and far between, the moments where you are in control of Ifrit are truly spectacular. And there you have it, that is the evolution of summons in the Final Fantasy series today. It is likely in keeping with the combat mechanics of Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth that in the third entry in the Remake trilogy they will likely function in a similar way to those two titles. However, we will have to wait until more details are announced around the third and final entry to know for certain. If you've made it this far, then make sure to hit that subscribe button to support the channel, and as always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.